In the fall of 1917, at the height of fierce fighting on the Western Front, the British monitor HMS Terror, part of the Dover Patrol, was carrying out a combat mission, shelling fortified ground targets on the coast of occupied Belgium. These operations were part of a large-scale campaign to suppress German artillery batteries that controlled the coast and interfered with British shipping in the English Channel. On October 19, 1917, the Terror was near Dunkirk when it was suddenly attacked by 3 German destroyers, A-59, A-60, and A-61. The German ships acted boldly and in unison. They quickly closed in on the British monitor and fired several torpedoes at it. During a short but fierce battle, the Terror was hit by 3 torpedoes at once, all on the starboard side. 2 hit the bow, and the third hit closer to the center of the hull. The explosions were powerful and potentially fatal for any other ship of that time. The monitor's hull shook noticeably from the hits, the bow was seriously damaged, and water began to pour into the compartments. Despite the heavy damage, the Terror miraculously remained afloat. The ship's commander, showing composure and determination, ordered the ship to be immediately beached to prevent it from sinking. This decision allowed them to gain precious time, save the crew, and prepare the ship for a rescue operation. Later, when the monitor was successfully refloated and towed to a dock for repairs, experts were amazed by what they found. As it turned out, all 3 torpedoes had struck not just the side of the ship, but a special structural element, the so-called anti-torpedo bulb or bulge, which is an external longitudinal thickening of the underwater part of the hull. This element was specially designed to reduce damage from underwater explosions. The bulb absorbed the main shock wave and the energy of the explosion, destroying itself but saving the main hull of the ship. It was thanks to this innovative design that the Terror did not sink, although 3 hits, especially to the bow, would normally have been fatal for any ship. In the early days, when torpedo weapons were just beginning to be used in the Navy, the only salvation for large ships was their own deck artillery. Torpedoes were launched from a relatively short distance, as the first torpedoes were not very fast and did not have a long range. This meant that a torpedo boat, whether a destroyer or a torpedo boat, had to approach the target at a dangerously close distance in order to fire an effective salvo. Under such conditions, the attacked ship could well have time to visually detect the threat and destroy the approaching enemy boat or destroyer with its rapid-fire guns. Thus, in the early stages of torpedo development, the fleet had a chance to deal with the threat by relying on the vigilance of lookouts, the quick reaction of gunners, and the coordination of the crew. However, torpedo weapons developed rapidly. With each new generation, the range, speed, and accuracy of torpedoes increased. By the beginning of the 20th century, models capable of covering dozens of cable lengths at speeds previously considered fantastic had appeared. This was enough to change the balance of power at sea. A torpedo boat could attack from beyond the limits of direct visibility, and the target had less and less time to react. Artillery lost its effectiveness as the main means of defense. There was an urgent need for new technical solutions capable of protecting large warships from underwater threats. One of the first means of active defense was the so-called anti-torpedo net. This structure consisted of a canvas woven from strong steel rings, which was suspended along the sides of the ship on special trusses and frames. The net was lowered into the water to a depth reaching the keel, completely covering the vulnerable underwater part of the hull. In 1874, the first successful tests of this technology were conducted. During the experiment, all torpedoes fired at the ship were intercepted and neutralized by the net. This seemed like a real breakthrough. A simple and inexpensive means of protecting a ship without the involvement of the crew was seen as a salvation from a new threat. However, this solution soon revealed a serious drawback. A ship equipped with an anti-torpedo net lost its ability to move at high speed. The water resistance created by the net slowed the ship to a minimum and made it virtually unmanageable. In addition, the cumbersome structures that held the net in place impaired maneuverability and increased the ship's silhouette. As a result, the ship became an easy target for enemy artillery. Thus, anti-torpedo nets proved effective only under strictly limited conditions, when a ship was anchored at its base, guarding a port, or awaiting repairs. In active combat conditions on the open sea, this method was practically useless. It was necessary to find an engineering solution that would provide protection without limiting the ship's performance. The search for a suitable method of protection against torpedoes continued, and soon the history of the fleet took another sharp turn. In 1906, Great Britain launched a new type of battleship, HMS Dreadnought. Its appearance was a revolutionary event in the history of world shipbuilding. Dreadnought was the first to embody the concept of single caliber. Instead of a variety of guns of different calibers, it carried only heavy guns mounted in turrets. This meant that it could engage in combat at long ranges without fear of insufficient range of its guns. But it was not only its artillery power that made the Dreadnought a landmark ship. It was also the first battleship equipped with a turbine engine, which gave it much greater speed compared to the previous generation of dreadnoughts. This made the ship more mobile and less vulnerable to torpedo attacks. Its design also included improved underwater protection elements, a multi-layer bulkhead system, reinforced sides below the waterline, and internal hollow compartments capable of absorbing the impact of a torpedo. The appearance of the Dreadnought marked the beginning of a new era in naval history. Its very name became a household word. All heavy battleships of the new generation were called dreadnoughts, while previous ships were referred to as pre-dreadnoughts. From that moment on, naval strategies, combat tactics, and ship design around the world began to change rapidly, taking into account the new realities, and, first and foremost, the rapidly growing danger posed by torpedo weapons. At the heart of the phenomenon that became known in world naval history as the dreadnought lay a key concept that revolutionized shipbuilding in the early 20th century. This was the so-called all big guns principle. Its essence was that a ship was now seen as a single combat platform designed exclusively to house powerful main-caliber artillery in rotating turrets. Unlike previous battleships, which were equipped with a variety of guns of different calibers, from heavy to small, designed to combat destroyers, dreadnoughts relied on standardization. They were equipped only with heavy guns with long range, high penetrating power, and high rate of fire. Small caliber artillery was still present, but in very limited quantities and performed exclusively auxiliary functions, countering light torpedo boats, repelling landings, and close defense. The main firepower was now concentrated in the main caliber turrets, which were arranged in a linear pattern, providing salvo fire to the bow, stern, and sides. This allowed combat to be conducted at long ranges without approaching the enemy and minimizing their opportunities for torpedo attacks. Thus, the dreadnought became more than just a ship. It became a new type of naval thinking, where everything was subordinated to firepower and long-range superiority. But the dreadnought would not have been a dreadnought if the changes had only affected its armament. Engineers also radically revised their approach to the power plant. HMS Dreadnought, which gave its name to an entire class of ships, was equipped with 18 steam boilers running on oil and coal, as well as 4 Parsons steam turbines. These turbines allowed the ship to reach speeds previously unheard of for battleships, over 21 knots, almost 40 kilometers per hour, and, more importantly, to maintain them for long periods of time. This made the ship not only powerful but also fast, a combination previously considered almost impossible for such large and heavy vessels. Mobility coupled with firepower made dreadnoughts the dominant force at sea. Special attention was also paid to the issue of protection. In addition to the traditional reinforced armor of the superstructure, the frontal plates of the turrets, casemates, bridges, and conning towers, engineers for the first time worked out in detail a comprehensive system of underwater protection against torpedoes, mines, and underwater explosions. The hull design below the waterline was a sophisticated multi-layered structure. It consisted of a whole system of transverse and longitudinal bulkheads forming numerous watertight compartments. The first, outer layer, located close to the side, was usually filled with coal, which was used as the main fuel at that time. It acted as a kind of buffer, absorbing the initial shock wave from the explosion. About 5 meters from the outer hull was a second layer, a system of hollow compartments with no openings, hatches, or pipes. These compartments served as a shock-absorbing space that softened the pressure of the explosion and prevented it from being transmitted to vital parts of the ship. Only the largest compartments were equipped with drainage and flooding systems so that, if necessary, the ship's stability could be controlled and its roll or sinking prevented. This system allowed damage to be localized, preventing flooding from spreading throughout the hull. Interestingly, the outer perimeter of the dreadnought and other dreadnoughts did not use continuous armor protection, as was the practice on older battleships. Instead, the concept of so-called armor screens was used. They were installed only in critical areas, above the ammunition magazines, around the main caliber turrets, in the area of the power plant and steering gear. This approach saved weight and money while strengthening protection where it was really needed. This well-thought-out and balanced defense scheme ensured the ship's remarkable survivability. According to calculations, this design allowed the Dreadnought to withstand hits from even 457mm torpedoes with a charge of up to 70 kilograms of explosives, figures that were considered lethal for most ships of that time. This entire underwater protection system, developed for dreadnoughts, was an engineering solution that combined thoughtful design with calculations based on the physical properties of materials and the environment. It worked as follows. When a torpedo hit the ship's side and an underwater explosion occurred, the entire force of the blast wave and gas bubble fell on the outer layer of the hull, the very first barrier, most often consisting of thin bulkheads and coal bunkers. This layer was supposed to absorb a significant part of the explosion's energy, extinguish the shock wave, and disperse the gas bubble and shrapnel impact. The coal in these compartments was supposed to act as an excellent shock absorber, capable of extinguishing the force of detonation due to its loose structure and ability to absorb energy. The blast wave remaining after the first barrier, as well as some of the gases and fragments, encountered a second protective layer in its path: sealed cavities without any openings, pipes, or hatches. These hollow compartments were designed to further dissipate energy. In a closed space with no weak points, they effectively contained the residual pressure, preventing it from spreading to the internal compartments of the hull. Thus, the energy of the explosion reached the critical areas, where the crew, combat information system, engine room, ammunition storage, and ship control units were located, in a significantly weakened form. In the worst case, there was deformation of the bulkheads or local flooding, but no catastrophic destruction. Nevertheless, even with the effective operation of the protection system, a torpedo hit inevitably caused a list. The ship began to fall onto the damaged side. And this is where another part of the engineering scheme came into play: the system of ballast compartments and controlled flooding. The crew could quickly fill similar compartments on the opposite side, leveling the hull. This allowed the ship to remain combat-ready and stable, as well as ensuring maneuverability, which was critically important in combat conditions. This design solved two important problems at once. First, it provided reliable protection against torpedoes and underwater explosions, which were becoming increasingly powerful. Second, it did not require the installation of a continuous thick armor belt below the waterline along the entire length of the hull, which would inevitably lead to a huge increase in the ship's weight and a deterioration in its performance. Thus, the Dreadnought maintained a balance between protection, mobility, and firepower, the three pillars on which the concept of the dominant battleship was based. However, as is often the case with ambitious engineering solutions, practice quickly showed that theory does not always coincide with reality. The most vulnerable element turned out to be the idea of using coal as a shock-absorbing filler. In theory, the coal placed in the bunkers of the first protective layer was supposed to act as a buffer, dampening the wave and absorbing the energy of the explosion. But in practice, things turned out to be far from clear-cut. The absorption effect was not as strong as expected. Moreover, if the coal compartment was not completely filled, and during long voyages, coal consumption was uneven, cavities formed in the empty space, where the shock wave was reflected and amplified. Even more dangerous was the accumulation of coal dust. When the ship was not fully loaded or moored carelessly, coal spilled and crumbled, turning into a fine suspension that created an extremely explosive atmosphere in the confined space of the first layer of the hull. When hit by a torpedo and a hot gas bubble formed, such dust could ignite, literally like gunpowder, amplifying the explosion instead of extinguishing it. In addition to existing measures aimed at protecting warships from underwater attacks, it became clear that even a multi-layered anti-torpedo defense system did not always guarantee complete safety. Combat experience showed that the explosion of a modern torpedo, especially one with an increased explosive charge, was still capable of piercing bulkheads, destroying external compartments, and penetrating deep into the hull. As a result, vital compartments such as the engine room, power plant, or ammunition magazines could be flooded, and the damage proved fatal to the ship. The response to this was the further development of the structural protection system. First, the designers introduced a new armored bulkhead into the design, located between the internal protective compartments and the main compartments where the critical systems were located. This bulkhead was a strong, thick steel wall designed to absorb the residual blast wave and fragments that broke through the outer layers. It served as the last barrier between the destructive energy of the torpedo and the heart of the ship. This measure made it possible, even in the event of a breach of the external protection, to preserve the survivability of the ship, prevent the instant death of the crew, and allow time for rescue operations. At the same time, research was conducted to optimize the internal structure of the protective compartments. During numerous tests, including real explosions, it was established that the energy of the gas bubble formed at the center of an underwater explosion is most effectively extinguished not by coal or water, as previously thought, but by ordinary empty sealed compartments. These cavities created conditions in which the pressure dropped sharply, the shock wave lost its destructive force, and the energy surge, finding no dense medium for transmission, dissipated. Thus, the anti-torpedo protection compartments became completely welded, sealed, without any technological openings, pipes, hatches, or valves. Moreover, they began to be made smaller in volume, which made it possible to increase their total number. Instead of 2 or 3 large compartments on one side, there were now 5 or 6 small ones, alternating in layers. This ensured a more even distribution of the explosion's energy and minimized the likelihood of through-and-through destruction of the hull. This design was already in full use during World War I, and experience in naval battles confirmed its relative effectiveness. When torpedoes hit directly, ships were often damaged but did not sink, and crews had time to organize a fight for survival. However, the development of torpedoes went hand in hand with the development of defenses. Already during World War I, new torpedo models had significantly higher speeds, increased warheads, and more reliable detonators. It became clear that even improved multi-layer protection would soon prove insufficient again. It was during this period, in 1915, that British naval engineer and director of naval construction Sir Eustace Tennyson d'Eyncourt put forward an innovative proposal that had a significant impact on the further evolution of shipbuilding. He proposed, in addition to internal multi-layered protection, the introduction of an external passive structure located along the sides of the ship. This structure consisted of special bulges surrounding the underwater part of the hull, inside which were bulkheads similar to those used in the hull. This design was called an anti-torpedo blister, or bulge, colloquially known as a bulge. This was the first introduction of an external anti-torpedo shell in the history of shipbuilding. According to d'Eyncourt's idea, the blister was not supposed to significantly affect the speed of the ship, since it was designed as a streamlined superstructure that smoothly transitioned into the main hull shape. Anti-torpedo protection in the form of an external contour, the so-called bulges, has been an integral part of the design of heavy warships since its inception. This structure, mounted along the side of the ship and covering the most important parts of the hull, had its own internal structure and was designed to mitigate or completely absorb the energy of an underwater explosion. The bulge extended from the area of the main caliber bow turrets and ammunition magazines to the stern compartments, covering all key elements of the ship that were vulnerable to potential torpedo threats. Inside the blister, there were usually 1 or 2 layers of protective partitions, and its upper part was assembled at an angle toward the side. This design feature allowed the blast wave to be partially redirected upward and away from the main hull structure. This was an important engineering technique, as part of the energy, instead of being concentrated in one place, was directed upward, where it caused less damage. Thus, the effectiveness of the protection increased, especially in combination with the internal layers of damping compartments. The first combat tests of the bulwark system took place in 1914, when they were installed on 4 Edgar-class armored cruisers during modernization and repair. This not only extended the service life of these ships, but also allowed the innovation to be tested in combat conditions. The results were positive, and soon bulges began to be designed as part of the structure from the outset. In particular, full protective contours were laid down during the construction of the Renown-class battlecruisers. This marked the beginning of an era when the bulge system became standard practice in shipbuilding and began to develop actively, including through experimentation. Engineers studying the behavior of shock waves underwater determined that the best way to dampen their energy was to place a compartment filled with ordinary water, rather than air or coal, in their path. Fresh water has excellent damping properties, and shock waves passing through a water medium quickly lose their force. Taking this physical effect into account, it was decided to make one of the internal layers of protection water-filled. In the design of the first generation of bulges, the inner compartments were left air-filled, while those closer to the hull were filled with water, creating a multi-layered barrier: air, water, steel, internal ship systems. This idea was put into practice in 1917 on the Revenge-class battleships, in the British classification, R-class battleships, where special elements, hollow sealed tubes, as well as wooden blocks and plates, began to be placed inside the bulges. These materials were used in an attempt to further dampen the pressure while minimizing the flooding of the blisters themselves. The designers hoped that the tubular structure and wood would be able to absorb the energy of the explosion, preventing the blister from filling with water and causing the ship to list. However, in practice, this idea did not have a significant effect. Flooding still occurred, and the improvement in the ship's stability was minimal. Nevertheless, these attempts demonstrated the desire of the world's navies to experiment and seek optimal solutions, adapting their defenses to real combat threats. Similar experiments were conducted in other countries. In 1934, Italian shipbuilders attempted to implement their own version of the water bulge, but the result was similar to the British one. The expected effectiveness was not achieved. Nevertheless, the very fact of widespread use and the desire for improvement testifies to the high importance of anti-torpedo protection in the doctrines of maritime powers. The world's leading naval powers, Great Britain, Germany, the United States, France, Italy, and Japan, approached torpedo protection issues in different ways. Although the general idea remained the same, to create a multi-level barrier between the outer shell and the ship's vital systems, the layout of these barriers, the materials used, the presence or absence of liquid in the compartments, the thickness of the bulkheads, and the types of armor varied from country to country. Depending on the schools of engineering and available technologies, designers either relied on simplicity and repeatability or implemented complex composite solutions. The approach used in the German Navy deserves special attention. German engineers, as a rule, paid great attention to the details and geometry of protection. In some designs, the elements of the system were assembled with the upper bulkheads inclined and extending towards the inner compartments of the hull. This multi-layered protective structure significantly mitigated the effects of an underwater explosion, dissipating the energy of the torpedo before it reached the main compartments of the ship. This was achieved thanks to the well-thought-out physics of the interaction between the blast wave and the environment. At the moment of detonation of the torpedo's warhead, a powerful gas bubble is formed, an area of high temperature and high pressure gas that begins to expand rapidly. When it encounters a structure that includes internal cavities and chambers, the bubble loses some of its energy, stretching as the volume of the chambers and the resistance of the environment increase. Compartments filled with air or water create a barrier where the explosive energy is partially dissipated. This, in turn, reduces the pressure on the main hull. Immediately behind these damping compartments were traditionally located coal bunkers, although later their use was abandoned due to inefficiency and the potential danger of coal dust formation. Such a system was usually internal and did not necessarily extend to the hull in the form of blisters. In other words, the structural anti-torpedo protection could be completely hidden inside the ship's hull without affecting its external shape and hydrodynamic properties. Interestingly, this design was also actively used on large Soviet warships, especially in the post-war years. In the domestic engineering school, it was called a three-dimensional anti-torpedo protection system. Special elements were used inside it, expansion chambers, or so-called filtration chambers. Their task was the same: to absorb and extinguish the pressure from the gas bubble formed at the moment of explosion. The chambers had a complex geometry, could have a variable cross-section, and a combined filling, for example, alternating layers of air and water. Soviet engineers went even further. They calculated and arranged the protective elements taking into account the expected impact vectors, trying to create a system that would work when an explosion occurred at different angles. At first glance, it might seem that a ship equipped with such a complex and multi-layered protection system, internal barriers, filtration chambers, armored bulkheads, and external bulges along the sides, should be virtually invulnerable to torpedoes. However, in reality, things were not so simple. Despite all the engineering sophistication, the developers continued to introduce new elements: water compartments, layers of hollow tubes, wooden inserts, airtight cells, combinations of rubber plates, and even absorbent gels. And all this was not out of an excess of caution, but because the war between torpedoes and defenses was, in essence, an arms race in which underwater projectiles almost always outpaced defensive measures. Torpedoes developed rapidly. Their warheads became increasingly sophisticated, the charge weight increased, detonators were improved, and magnetic fuses were introduced, allowing the torpedo to be detonated not on contact with the hull, but under the keel, the most vulnerable point of the ship. Stabilization systems appeared, allowing torpedoes to change their depth during the attack, bypass defenses, and target the most vulnerable areas. Classic anti-torpedo bulges, designed to protect the hull, proved almost powerless against torpedoes exploding directly under the ship. As a result, the entire complex defense system described above worked, so to speak, 50-50 in a real combat situation. That is, its effectiveness was inconsistent and largely depended on a variety of factors. The exact point of impact played an important role. A hit in the area between sections, at the joint of the armored deck, or in the area of the bilge drains could lead to critical damage. It was also important at what angle and at what depth the explosion occurred, what charge was used, and whether it was a single attack or a salvo of several torpedoes. In the case of a single hit on a well-protected part of the ship, it could survive, albeit with damage. However, if there were 2, 3, or more torpedoes, and they hit different parts of the hull, no system could save even the largest warship from sinking. A good example of the limitations of traditional anti-torpedo defense systems was the tragic case of the British battleship Royal Oak. This ship, anchored in the supposedly well-protected harbor of Scapa Flow in October 1939, just a month after the start of World War II, was considered to be sufficiently well protected. It had both internal multi-layered structural protection and external bulges, inside which were watertight compartments and damping elements. However, this did not save it. The German submarine U-47, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Gunther Prien, entered the harbor unnoticed and fired torpedoes, one of which hit the Royal Oak. A second salvo followed shortly thereafter, and the ship sank within 15 minutes. 833 people were killed. This incident shocked the British Admiralty and became clear evidence that even the most modern passive defense systems at the time were not a panacea. This and similar episodes prompted designers, naval strategists, and military engineers to rethink the very approach to defending ships from torpedoes. Gradually, the concept of so-called combined defense emerged, combining both passive and active elements. Passive elements still included multi-layered bulkhead systems, blisters, water or air compartments, armor screens, filtration chambers, etc. However, active defense measures were now added to these, aimed at preventing the attack itself or reducing its effectiveness before impact. Among these active measures, the tactic of zigzagging took on particular importance. This simple but effective method made it more difficult for the enemy to aim. A torpedo designed to hit a linear target would easily miss when the ship maneuvered. Another measure, demagnetization of the ship's hull, was a response to the emergence of magnetic mines and torpedoes with magnetic or induction fuses that reacted to the magnetic field of the steel hull. Special coils and devices were installed on ships to neutralize or knock down the magnetic profile of the vessel, making it less visible to sensitive detonators. In addition, more technically complex solutions began to be introduced. This led to the emergence of so-called torpedo deflecting devices, towed decoys that imitated the noise and magnetic field of a ship. They were designed to distract smart torpedoes with acoustic and magnetic guidance. Some of them imitated the sound of propellers, while others created interference in the torpedo's guidance system, causing it to veer off course. Later, with the development of electronics, active acoustic protection systems appeared, capable of suppressing homing signals or temporarily disabling the electronic components of enemy torpedoes. With the development of technology during the Cold War, and especially in the 21st century, torpedo defense has become part of a complex network defense. Modern surface ships are equipped with a whole arsenal of anti-torpedo measures, hydroacoustic stations for detecting underwater threats, automatic means of setting false targets, and active torpedo interceptors, small, fast-reacting devices capable of independently homing in on an approaching torpedo and destroying it before it explodes. Work is also underway on laser systems and electro-optical systems for detecting torpedo wake bubbles, which allow the direction of attack to be determined instantly. Thus, modern shipbuilding continues to pay enormous attention to the issue of the torpedo threat. Although designs and principles have changed significantly over the past 100 years, the essence remains the same. Torpedoes are one of the most dangerous threats to any ship, and protection against them requires constant development, technical progress, and tactical flexibility. The confrontation between offensive and defensive weapons in the underwater sphere continues to this day. And although no system can provide an absolute guarantee, modern solutions make it highly likely to detect, identify, and neutralize a threat before it reaches its target. This is a constant race in which each new technology can provide a short-term advantage, but does not eliminate the conflict of interest between those who attack and those who defend.